I sing praises to your name. For our Spanish-speaking friends, that's for you.
That's French.
Oh, it's French? I'm sorry. For our French-speaking friends, that's for you. And now it's in a language I understand. Lord, praises to your name. Oh, Lord, for your name is great. Name is great and greatly to be praised. Yes, thank you, Jesus. I sing praises to your name. Oh, Lord, praises to your name. Oh, Lord, for your name is great. And greatly to be praised. Well, that's Shekinah Glory. If you'd like to know more about how you can get a hold of that song and their new CD, you can send us an email and we'll forward it to them. Welcome to lesson number 9 of the 10-lesson course, Paul, Women, and Church. And the lesson today is called The Nature of the False Teaching in Ephesus. Because if you were with us last week, and if you weren't with us last week, you really need to listen to last week's lesson, lesson number 8. And because we were talking last week about the historical context of 1 Timothy. And all of life has context. You can't understand life without context, and you can't understand any kind of literature without context, and you can't understand the Bible without context, and we can't understand 1 Timothy without understanding the context. And in light of the context, it was very clear from last week that 1 Timothy, Paul did not write 1 Timothy as an order of church manual, legislating who can teach and who cannot teach in the church. That's not the context. That's not why he wrote it. But it was so clear that his purpose in writing was dealing with false teaching. And he and Timothy were dealing with false teaching, and he wanted to silence the false teachers in Ephesus, both men and women. It's not about silencing anyone because of their gender. It's about silencing false teachers. That's what 1 Timothy is about. And so you really need to hear lesson 8 if you haven't already. Now, lesson number 9, we're going to talk about the character or the nature of that false teaching that they were dealing with. And we get a glimpse, a hint of what this false teaching was in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And I believe we did look at these verses last week, and we looked at hesukia, the word for silence and so on. We may allude to that again. But let's look right now at 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12. This passage that has been misconstrued and misused to silence half of the body of Christ. It has hampered missions. It has hampered the work of the church. It has weakened and caused the church to be anemic in the world. And so, folks, what we are teaching is so important, and I hope you will spread this teaching through your social media and get it out there. There may be nothing more powerful to ignite a revival in America and all over the world than these last 2 lessons that we've been doing. Actually, all of these lessons, this course, but especially these last 2, because 1 Timothy 2, 11 and 12 has been used more than any other scripture to silence and marginalize the voice of women in the church and in society. So that's why we are dealing with this. And this is why I say These could be a very powerful tool to ignite genuine revival in the churches in America and around the world. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. And I do want to point out that phrase, and I believe I did point this out last week, but this is worth repeating. And I do not permit is in the Greek, it's in a continuous, ongoing sense. Literally, I am not permitting. I am not permitting, which points to a restriction specific to the current situation in Ephesus. In other words, it would be like saying, I am not now permitting, or I am not permitting at this time. It's very significant that Paul used a verb tense that is continuous and ongoing. So literally, I am not permitting a woman to teach or to have authority. I'm not permitting a woman to teach. Now, teaching is the problem here. And not a woman teaching, but the problem is false teaching, as we looked at so in depth and clearly in chapter 1 and verse 3 last week. But the word we are going to focus on today is the Greek word that is translated authority in verse 12. For I am not permitting a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. And I must emphasize again that the word silence there is hesukia, and it does not mean to zip your lip. It does not mean not to speak. It speaks more of an attitude. It speaks more of an atmosphere. And it refers to an atmosphere of tranquility and quietness that is free of upset and turmoil. This word is also used in relation to men. It's used of both men and women in Paul's, I believe it's 1 Thessalonians, where Paul said that he wanted all of those Thessalonian believers to eat their bread with quietness. In other words, some of them had been busybodies and not minding their own business and causing upset and turmoil in the Christian community. And Paul said, I want all of you to eat your own food, to eat your bread with hesukia, without upset and turmoil, with quietness and tranquility. And so it has nothing to do with zipping your lip and not talking. It has to do with an attitude that is not causing upset, an attitude of quietness and tranquility and calmness. And that is what all of us want. That's what we want, isn't it? In our homes, in our marriages, in our friendships, in our churches, is hesukia. This is what we all need. And so Paul does use it particularly in reference to, he uses the word a woman here for a reason. And that reason is going to come forth as we also look, not only is it hesukia, but also at this word authority, which is translated from the Greek word althentane. And you see the word there, althentane, on the screen. And the word althentane, it means to seek the upper hand, to dominate or control. And at least once in ancient literature outside the Bible, althentane was used of a murder. Someone murdered someone and they were said to have althentaned the person. But it is a negative word that means to seek to have the upper hand, to be in charge, to be in control, to be dominant. It is a negative word. And by the way, this is the only place in the New Testament that this word is found. Isn't that amazing? Why does Paul, and this should immediately raise questions and yellow flags in our minds. So authority is really not the best word here, because the normal Greek word for authority is exousia. Paul himself uses the Greek word exousia over 100 times. It is used by other biblical writers, and it is the positive biblical word for the exercise of authority, which can also mean the right to act or freedom. But that is not the word that is used here. So probably it would be better if the translators used another word. Maybe if they use a word dominate or control with an explanatory note at the bottom or out to the side. But by using the word authority, we totally lose what Paul is expressing here. And again, let me say it again. This word that he uses here that is translated authority is not the normal New Testament word for authority, exousia, that Paul uses over 100 times in his own writings and other biblical writers use as well. This word authentane, we have had to go outside of the Bible to find out its meaning. And in ancient literature, it's obvious that this is what it meant. It referred to someone who was trying to gain the upper hand, who was trying to dominate or control another person or a situation. And as I already said, it was used at least once in relation to a murder. A person was said to have authentained this other person that was murdered. So what in the world is Paul doing using this word here? Now, this very fact that Paul uses this word that neither he nor any other biblical writer ever uses, that in itself tells us that Paul is not talking about the normal use or the normal exercise of authority in the church. That in itself tells us that he's talking about a unique and different situation that is peculiar and particular to what is going on in Ephesus at the time that he is writing this letter to Timothy in Ephesus. And I will say this again. If you didn't hear the former lesson 8, you need to go back to it because this lesson is a continuation of it. But Paul is writing to Timothy, who is in the city of Ephesus, confronting false teaching. Paul has been in Ephesus prior to this at least twice. The last time he and Timothy were there together. And they were back and they were encountering the believers that had come to Christ through Paul's 3 years of ministry that you can read about in Acts 19. And many new people had come to the Lord in this very pagan city of Ephesus. And now Paul and Timothy are there, and they encounter a very troubling, false, demonic teaching that is going around that Paul expresses in 1 Timothy chapter 3. And when it came time for them to move on to the churches in Macedonia, to Philippi and Thessalonica, Paul was so concerned, and we read this in chapter 1, verse 3, he urged Timothy to stay behind to continue to confront the false teaching. And now he's writing this letter to encourage and instruct Timothy in his unsavory task of confronting the false teachers. Now, this word is very appropriate, and it probably gives us a hint and an indication of what the false teaching is like. But because Paul is saying here, I am not permitting a woman to try to gain the upper hand or dominate or control a man. He doesn't say he's not permitting a woman to exousia or have the right and freedom to minister, to lead and all of this, which if he was giving a manual for church order, he would have used exousia. But no, he's talking about the particular situation in Ephesus. And he says, I am not permitting a woman to authentane, to seek to gain the upper hand, to have control, to have the upper hand, to be dominant over a man. Is this what is happening in Ephesus? It must be. Otherwise, why would Paul use this word? This gives us a hint of what this false teaching is happening. And I believe it has something to do with the character of the city of Ephesus. If you recall last week, We talked about how, actually it was 2 weeks ago we talked about this when we were talking about marriage, but we reminded you of it again last week, that Ephesus, a very pagan city, the largest city in the Roman province of Asia, was characterized by two things. It was characterized by the worship of the famous female goddess called Artemis, whose magnificent temple was located in Ephesus. This magnificent temple, which was considered one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and there you see a drawing of the temple dedicated to Artemis. And people came from all over the Roman Empire, both to see this magnificent temple and to worship at its shrine. And much of the economy of Ephesus was based on the tourism of the thousands of devotees of Artemis who continually streamed into Ephesus to view her temple and to worship at her shrine. There was also within the temple an image of Artemis, and somebody has and this is what an ancient image looked like of Artemis. There was one in her temple that is referred to in Acts 19. Now we don't know if this is what it looked like or not, but in Acts 19 they refer to her image, they say, which fell out of heaven. And some biblical scholars think that maybe it was a meteorite that had some kind of, likeness to a female likeness, and that they took it and set it up in her image. But we don't know for sure. But here is an ancient image that was made of Artemis, and you will see that she is covered with many breasts, because one thing about her, she was a fertility goddess, totally self-sufficient. She had no need of anyone else. She had no need of a male. She had no need of a male cohort to produce offspring. She could produce offspring herself without any cooperation or involvement of a male cohort. She was a fertility goddess, a goddess of supremacy, totally self-sufficient. There is one ancient legend, you have probably heard of the ancient legend and myth of this, which may be based in an element of truth, of an ancient army made up all of women, warriors. They were known as the Amazons, and a very powerful female army made up only of women warriors. And according to one legend, they originated in Ephesus, and Artemis was their hero and their role model. Now, you have to realize one thing, that when Paul ministered in a city, and when he left that city, he did not have any tapes to leave with them that they could listen to over and over. There were no printing presses. He had no books to leave with them to read. There was nothing he could leave with them except the remembrance of his lifestyle and the remembrance of what he had said. Oh, what advantages we have in this modern world with the modern technology. And that is one reason Paul was so careful of how he lived his lives in the cities. And you'll find in some of his letters that he would write to them and he would remind them and say, you remember how we, and he would refer to himself and his team, you remember how we walked among you when we were with you. Because this was all he had to leave with them, was the remembrance. Oh, if we could get a hold of this today. Oh, if pastors and preachers could get a hold of this today. And Paul would remind them, because he knew the only thing he could leave when he left a city was his example. Not just what he had said. They would remember more what he did than they would what he said. Someone has said, and it's true, that we teach a little bit by what we say. We teach more by what we do, but we teach most of all by who and what we are. And Paul, in his letters, he would often say, remember how we walked and lived among you when we were there, and follow our example. Because they didn't have a Bible. They didn't have a CD or DVD to listen to. And all he could do was write them a letter and remind them of the example he and his team had left for them, and remind them again of the words that he had spoken when he was there, and speak some new words to them. And so in this kind of situation, it was very easy for different thoughts and concepts and belief systems to get mixed up together. Oh, this is happening today. It's known as syncretism. Syncretism is the combining together of different belief systems. Even though it's not rational, even though it's not logical, but in this modern, what's called this postmodern world, where rationality and logic is being laid aside for what feels good and what feels right, and what you experience, what will cause you to have a good, positive spiritual experience. Syncretism is taking place even in the church today. And different belief systems are being brought and blended and joined together. There was a headline in the Dallas Morning News a few years ago. I cut it out. And it was on the religious page of the Dallas Morning News. And it said, 1 part Jesus, 2 parts Buddha. And the article went on to tell how that this is a growing trend in America, where people are combining Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam. They're drawing things that they like about these different religions, or they think they like, and they're trying to mix them all up and combine them together. I believe this is what is happening in Ephesus. We know from what Paul says and what he warns them about that there are people that they're wanting to teach the Jewish law, because there was a Jewish synagogue in this pagan city of Ephesus. And so we know that there is a Jewish element of people who are wanting to teach the Old Testament laws. We know also that people are very into genealogies and where they originated from, their family trees, and tracing back the origins of their ethnicity and where they originated from. Paul talks about genealogies, and he uses the Greek word mythos, from which we get myths. And people are combining ancient myths and genealogies with what Paul had taught them and left with them. And what would be one of the biggest myths and genealogies there in Ephesus? It would be myths about Artemis and her origins and where she came from, etc., etc. Now, is there any evidence that this was happening in Ephesus? Absolutely. There is evidence that teachings about Artemis had gotten mixed in with biblical accounts of creation. Accounts of Artemis and her female primacy had gotten mixed in with the Old Testament accounts of creation. And this is borne out in some discoveries, archaeological discoveries in the Middle East, of writings from around the time of Paul and later. And we're going to read some of these on the screen. And these are taken from a book that I would recommend. It's called I Suffer Not a Woman by Drs. Richard and Catherine Krager, whom Sue and I knew personally. They were good friends. We stayed in their home on Cape Cod on more than one occasion. Very astute scholars in the original languages and culture, and just a tremendous couple. They've gone on to be with the Lord. But we are indebted to them for doing this research. And so this is a writing that archaeologists have uncovered from people who were known as Gnostics. Now, I'll just say this. Gnostics were people who practiced syncretism. Some of them claimed to be Christians, but they tried to mix ancient paganism with biblical gospel truths. And you will see this here, and I believe that this gives us a hint of why Paul used this word althentane. Because you will see in these accounts of creation from these Gnostic Christian writings, they all give primacy to Eve. And Eve is the one who gives life to Adam, not God. Eve gives life to Adam. And Eve is the instructor of Adam, who gives him wisdom and knowledge. And this is what it says. This is an account of the creation. It says, the Spirit-filled woman came to him and spoke to him, saying, Arise, Adam. How you like that for an account of creation? The Spirit-filled woman came to him and spoke to him, saying, Arise, Adam. And when he saw her, he said, You are the one who has given me life. Who gave him life? The Spirit-filled woman, Eve. The one who is like Artemis. And you can see the influence of Artemis, the cultural influence of Artemis has infiltrated the accounts of creation in the Christian community there in Ephesus. And when he saw her, Adam saw her, he said, You are the one who has given me life. You will be called the mother of the living, because she is my mother. Adam never called Eve his mother. But here, she is Adam's mother. Because she is my mother, she is the female healer and the wife and the one who gave birth. Do you see how paganism has infiltrated the biblical account of creation? Now let's move on to the next one. After the day of rest, Sophia sent Zoe, her daughter, who is called Eve. Sophia means wisdom. Sent Zoe, her daughter, who is called Eve, as an instructor so that she should raise up Adam, who had no soul. There's a typo there. That should be soul, no D there. Who had no soul in him, so that those whom he would beget should become vessels of the light. So again, it is Zoe, it is Eve, who is the instructor of Adam and who is raising him up. When Eve saw her co-likeness lying flat, she showed pity upon him and said, Adam, live. Rise up upon the earth. Straightway her word became a deed, for when Adam had risen up, he immediately opened his eyes. When he saw her, he said, You will be called the mother of the living, because you are the one who has given me life. You know what I believe? And this word althentane speaks to this. I believe these archaeological discoveries give us some clues of what very likely is happening there in the city of Ephesus. And you know, it's interesting. I almost feel a weepiness inside about this. This is what Paul and Timothy are confronting in Ephesus. The cultural atmosphere of Ephesus committed to this world-famous female goddess whose magnificent temple is at Ephesus, who has primacy over all males, who is self-sufficient, who does not need a male. Somehow these stories of Artemis have infiltrated the creation stories, because people don't have Bibles. They don't have Bibles to go back and read. There are no printing presses. There is a synagogue in Ephesus, and it is possible they may not have, it is possible, but it's not for sure, that they would have had one copy of the Genesis account of creation. But if there was one in this huge city of Ephesus, there was only one, most likely, and it would belong to the Jewish synagogue. And so there is not any way to easily correct this. And so it's obvious that Paul and Timothy, we know this from 1 Timothy, they're confronting a false teaching that gives primacy to the female. It's like a radical feminist movement that would put down the men and put down the male and say that the woman is self-sufficient. And I think that may be a reason for Paul saying some things in 1 Timothy. For example, if you look over in chapter 3, verse 14, and he says, "Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry." It's funny, the people who hammer on 1 Timothy 2:12, "I suffer not a woman to teach," I wonder why they are not so adamant to make sure that we're not carrying out 1 Timothy 5:14, where he says, "I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some have already turned aside after Satan." Wow. Some people in the Christian community, this false teaching, and it's not just a wrong teaching. There are two words for different. And back in chapter 1, verse 3, Paul used the word heteros didaskaling, literally different doctrine, that we talked about in a former lesson. But it's not the word allos, which would mean a different of the same kind. It's heteros, it's a different of another kind. It is not. It's totally different from the gospel of Jesus Christ. And as far as Paul is concerned, this false teaching that has come in has totally distorted the Christian message. And it is demonic. And he says that some of the younger widows there have already turned aside after Satan. And so probably what Paul is dealing with here is this teaching that would tend to tell women and younger women, you don't need a man, you're totally self-sufficient. And they've mixed up the Old Testament stories of creation, giving Eve the primacy, even as the one who gave life to Adam and who instructed him. Folks, I am convinced. I have taught 1 Timothy pastoral epistles for years in college settings, year after year, where I've studied this year after year, semester after semester, in both Zion Bible College, at Christ for the Nations. So this is not something like I just started studying this last week. I've been studying and teaching this for years. I think Paul would roll over in his grave at how what he was instructing Timothy, the instructions he gave Timothy for dealing with the situation in Ephesus, how people have taken his words and distorted them and tried to apply them across the board and tried to diminish and marginalize and silence all women from teaching and preaching the Word of God. What a horrible, terrible thing has happened in the house of God that has weakened the church and hindered her from fulfilling her divine role and purpose in the earth. Folks, we need to correct this, and this is what we are doing. Now,
Eddie?
Yes, Sue. Yeah.
In my book, if you would hold it up for a minute.
Yes, absolutely.
I share how King James he expressed a real hatred for women.
Yes.
He vowed to silence women.
Right.
And so when he authorized 70 scholars to translate the scriptures, the Bible, because they were being paid by the King James,
Mm-hmm.
who authorized the King James Bible, they were being paid by him. They had reason to translate it in such a way as to please him, unfortunately.
Right, yes.
Because remember, every translation is to some degree an interpretation.
True, absolutely.
So there is a buffer there where, when you have to weigh scripture and make a decision,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to, in a case like the King James, the scholars are going to come down, the translators are going to come down on the side that favors the king. And remember, I'll say it again.
Yes.
He vowed to silence
That's
women.
true. Yeah, he sure did,
And
Sue.
so, you know, the King James Bible has been used to silence women. And this is one of the scriptures that has been used. So King James wielded a pretty big stick or whatever in his work.
Yes. And this book, Sue's book, it's out of print. And maybe somebody out there would like to give a donation to get this book back in print. How many did we print in all? I know we did 2 printings. At least 4,000, maybe 5,000 copies soon. They've been scattered all over the world. Still get orders for it, but we don't have any to send out anymore.
But
It is available.
Thanks to Edie Hicks, it is available in various ebook formats.
Yes, you can go to Sue's website, icwhp.org, and the bookstore, and also it's available in the Kindle format. But one thing about what we're talking about, Sue, that's so important, what you're talking about, the King James Version, and that's why when Hezekiah referred to women, the translators put silence and things like that. But what we're giving is the context. The context in which Paul originally wrote this letter. And it was written not to write a church manual for all churches everywhere. It was written to encourage and instruct his younger protege, Timothy, whom he had left behind in the pagan city of Ephesus, to confront false doctrine. And he's writing this letter to encourage and instruct Timothy in this very difficult and unsavory task of confronting the false teaching, which Paul says is turning people from Christ to Satan. It's a terrible thing. And so this passage has nothing to do. What can we learn from this? Is there anything we can learn from this? Oh, absolutely. We learn how important it is to protect the message, to not allow syncretism to infiltrate into the message that we preach, which many people are doing together. And here I'm going to close this session with a statement from the little letter of Jude. The little letter of Jude, which is, I believe it's the last book of the New Testament before Revelation. And many of you are familiar with this. And he starts out and he says, Jude, a bondservant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, to those who are called, sanctified by God the Father, and preserved in Jesus Christ, mercy, peace, and love be multiplied to you. Beloved, while I was very diligent to write to you concerning our common salvation, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. I found it necessary. This is what Paul is doing, and this is what we can learn from 1 Timothy, the importance of carrying out Jude 1:3. We too must earnestly contend for the faith. There is a definite article in front of faith. This is not talking about the faith that trusts and believes God. When you see the definite article in front of the faith, in some of Paul's letter he will talk about the faith. He's referring to those basic teachings, those basic essential teachings that make up the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ that brings salvation, the faith. And Jude says, I found it necessary to write to you, to exhort you, to earnestly contend for the faith, for that pure, unadulterated Christian teaching about Jesus Christ. I found it necessary, he said, to exhort you to earnestly contend for that, which was once and for all delivered unto the saints. Oh, my friends, the good news of Jesus Christ was once and for all delivered to us in the New Testament. Starting with the Gospels, the book of Acts, and then the epistles, which are letters written contending for that faith. And the one big thing that I want you to take away today that we can learn from 1 Timothy is the importance that we, here in the 21st century, 2,000 years later, we are still facing similar challenges that Paul and Timothy were facing in Ephesus. And we must earnestly contend. You have heard Sue and I talking about purging the message. That's what Paul and Timothy were seeking to do. The message has been distorted by tradition. This message in 1 Timothy has been totally distorted and used to minimize the voice of women and silence the voice of women.
Eddie, I'm concerned that my microphone was not on when I spoke about the power of King James in distorting the message.
Okay.
So perhaps you could summarize that before you close.
Sure. Yeah, Sue was just talking about, many of you use the King James Version. I know many of you probably don't today. But King James hated women. And he vowed, what was the word you used, Sue, to silence women?
That's right. He vowed to silence women.
He vowed to silence women. He hated women. And he vowed to silence women. And he is the one who commissioned. There had been English translations of the Bible before the King James Version. In fact, the Pilgrims who came to America, they did not use the King James Version. They used, what is the name of that version, Sue? They used, I'm as familiar with it almost as my name, but it completely slips my mind right now, but it will come back to me. They use the Geneva Version, New Testament Bible, but King James, he wanted another version that would reflect his views, and so he chose 70 scholars, high church people, many of them bishops in the Church of England, to translate the Bible. And so they were a part of the official state church. So they were very much influenced by King James's views in how they translated the Bible. Now, the King James is a good translation. I am not totally putting it down, but it is true. Any translation to one degree or another is an interpretation. Because, for example, Paul wrote in Greek. Paul wrote in Greek. Unless you know Greek and can go back and study the manuscripts, then you're going to have to put your trust into some translations. And that's why we need to compare translations. That's why Sue and I have studied Greek, so that we can go back and study. And so the Bible tells us to study to show ourselves approved unto God. But this passage has been so misused and misconstrued and taken out of its context, taken out of its life setting, of the original purpose that Paul wrote this letter. Not to give a church order for all churches everywhere, and not to tell who can teach and who cannot teach based on gender, but to confront and silence false teaching and false teachings, teachers and teachings, and to guard the faith, to guard that original message. And may you and I be diligent in this hour to guard the faith that 2,000 years ago, once and for all, was delivered to the saints. And in my studies of church history, one thing I've learned is every generation has to keep going back and recovering and discovering and purging that original message that was once and for all delivered to the saints. God bless you. See you next week with the final lesson 10 of Paul, Women, and Church.